But it was not that the British had promised the same territories to different players, as some people say Palestine, the twice promised land. In fact, there was no substantial discrepancy between the documents, and the British had generally been quite consistent. The British could not have promised Palestine to the Arab state without consulting France, their ally, and therefore Palestine was not promised to the Arabs. But Palestine was not promised to the Jews either. In reference to Zionist demands, what the British did do in the Balfour Declaration was to express their sympathy for a national home for the Jews in Palestine. So let's look at the Balfour Declaration. The war itself had its impact on the impending dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. This offered the Zionists the opportunity they were looking for to possibly obtain Palestine for themselves. The British themselves had their own interest in Palestine, particularly in connection to the protection of the Suez Canal and the passage to India. Prime Minister Lloyd George certainly recognized this British imperial interest. Lloyd George, however, also had a religious upbringing, and because of his knowledge of the Bible, the appeal of a British protected Jewish colony in Palestine made sense to the British Prime Minister. In 1917, the Allies were in a sorry state in the prosecution of the war, and the British believed issuing a declaration on behalf of Zionist aspirations in Palestine would improve the position of the Allies in the war. They believed that the United States could become more involved in the war and that Russia would stay in the war thanks to Jewish influence that would be exerted on these great powers to participate more actively in the war because of Zionist aspirations that would be promised by the British. That the support for Zionist aspirations would help propaganda in the US and Russia, and thus the war effort, thanks to the great effect of Jewish influence. However exaggerated this British opinion of Jewish influence may have been, and exaggerated it definitely was, this was a factor in their decision to issue the Balfour Declaration. So what did the declaration say exactly? In this letter by the British Foreign Minister, Lord Balfour, to the leader of the Jewish community in Great Britain, Lord Rothschild, the British government declared its sympathy for Zionist aspirations in Palestine. The British government, in this expression of sympathy, viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. It is interesting to note, view with favor, sympathy, somewhat less than outright express support and endorsement. Secondly, it was not entirely clear what a national home really meant. And thirdly, whatever this national home was to be, it was to be in Palestine, not the conversion of Palestine into a Jewish national home. These are two very different things. Furthermore, the declaration noted that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. That is, whatever the Jews did establish in Palestine could not be damaging to the rights of the Arab people who already lived there. This was all in a letter, as we have seen, by Balfour to Lord Rothschild. A rather low-key expression of British policy. It was not, for example, a declaration of policy given in Parliament. But nevertheless, for the Zionists, this was understood to mean support for a Jewish state. But as the British historian Malcolm Yep has summarized, the declaration was virtually meaningless and committed Britain to nothing. When the war came to an end in the Middle East, Britain was by far the superior power in that part of the world. This, as the British historian and journalist Elizabeth Munro has written, this was Britain's moment in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire had come to an end. The French were completely preoccupied at the front in France, and they could only spare token forces for the Middle East. Russia was preoccupied by revolution and her opting out of the war. So British occupation forces took over most of the Arab areas of the empire, in Syria, Iraq, and Palestine, and there was only a small French force in Lebanon. So the great powers, and especially Britain, could shape the region more or less as they wished. And the drawing of the borders of the future Arab states in the Middle East were very much part of British-French trade-offs. And it was the French, the weaker party, who made concessions to the British in both Palestine and Mosul. As you may recall from the Sykes-Picot Agreement, Palestine was shared by the French and the British. It was now given over by the French solely to Britain. Mosul became part of British-ruled Iraq rather than French-ruled Syria. These areas of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were now divided up by the victorious powers into mandates that were handed over to the French and to the British. At the conference of the European victorious powers that was held in San Remo in April 1920, the mandates were delivered to Britain and France. Lebanon and Syria became French mandates. Britain controlled Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. In this creation of the mandate system, there was a very significant upgrading of the British commitment to the Zionists. The British mandate for Palestine, as published officially in July 1922, transformed the commitment made in the Balfour Declaration to a British commitment to the international community, to the League of Nations, much more than a letter to Lord Rothschild. Moreover, the formal document of the mandate also recognized the historical ties of the Jewish people to Palestine. So while the mandate upgraded the British commitment to the Zionists, the mandate also determined finally that the area lying to the east of the Jordan would become an Arab state, that is Transjordan, and that area would be from the very outset excluded from the British commitments to the Zionists. Therefore, Transjordan as an Arab state would not be a zone of Jewish settlement or creation of the Jewish national home, which was now restricted to Western Palestine only. And Eastern Palestine now became Transjordan and destined to become an independent Arab state.